Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us. I'm Mackenzie Feldman, and I will be moderating this panel today titled Our Power, Exemplary Youth Activists. I am the executive director of an organization called Herbicide Free Campus, and we work with students and groundskeepers across the country to eliminate toxic herbicides from campus grounds. And I'm so excited today to moderate this panel with your 2021 Brower Youth Award winners, some of them here. And I was a 2019 Brower Youth Award winner, and so I'm really honored and grateful to be able to learn and moderate this awesome panel today with these 2021 winners. So I think we're going to bring them up here on the screen, and I'll introduce them. So first we have David Baldwin, a Fort Lauderdale, Florida-based activist who's done research alongside members of the Max Planck Florida Institute for Neuroscience and interned in a biochemistry lab at Florida Atlantic University. David has been doing groundbreaking work on finding innovative land management solutions to invasive weeds in his region. He's a member since he was 14 of the Everglades Restoration Ambassadors, a nonprofit that removes non-native plants, and he educates elementary school students about non-native species using educational modules he developed. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. And now we have Sonja Michaluk. Sonja is a Princeton, New Jersey-based young scientist and citizen science activist who participated in her first freshwater bioassessment as an eager 6-year-old, founding the Conservation Communities Initiative, which encourages people to monitor and protect their local aquatic habitats and advocate for data-driven environmental decision-making. This initiative runs a microbiology and genetics lab that facilitates use of a genetics-based bioassessment method that Sonja developed, which can identify the presence of threatened, endangered, and non-native species from trace water samples. Michaluk has recently helped secure several big wins for aquatic environments, including the modification of a natural gas pipeline to protect ecologically critical land in central New Jersey. Holy cow, that is a lot. So David is now studying in college in Florida. Sonja is now studying in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we have Artemisio Romero y Carver. He's an 18-year-old Santa Fe, New Mexico-based artist, poet, and organizer who helped found Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, also known as YUCCA, a youth-led nonprofit working to hold elected officials accountable for the health of the planet, future generations, and BIPOC communities by leading protests, lobbying for federal and state legislation, endorsing candidates, and educating voters. Arte currently is on a steering committee. He's a steering committee member and spokesperson for YUCCA and served as the policy director during New Mexico's 2021 legislation session, during which 3 of the organization's priority bills were passed. That's awesome. And was also Santa Fe's 2020 Youth Poet Laureate. Wow. And he's studying in St. Louis, Missouri right now. And finally, we have Peter Pham, San Jose, California-based environmental and transit justice activist with Turnout for Transit, a coalition of environmental advocacy groups, labor unions, and social justice organizations. Peter has been fighting for better public transit throughout the San Jose metropolitan region and beyond, with the goals of slashing regional emissions, decreasing traffic congestion, and helping local residents access opportunities. This past year, Peter and his colleagues helped pass a ballot measure to generate $100 million for rail services in San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara counties. And everyone here is a 2021 Brower Youth Award winner, and you can find more about their work and videos at the Brower Youth Award website. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and those are going to go to me. First, I just wanted to ask you all, can you tell us just a little bit about how you got started in this work, how you found yourself doing these incredible things? And we'll start with you, David.
Okay, so I came from a family of scientists and everything. So I was always surrounded by STEM and always found a passion for it. And then as I got older and when I just became a teenager, I really wanted to get my hands dirty and do some science, per se. And so I sent out hundreds of emails to PIs at local universities, and one stuck, and it was in a neuroscience lab, which is not something that I really planned on doing because I wanted to stay in environmental science. I thought that was really cool. But then I got to learn some incredible skills of data collection and scientific method and procedures. And then I stuck in that lab for the next 3 years. And then as my passions changed and developed, I got into another lab, the biogeochemistry lab, and that is where I started doing some work in invasive species, and particularly invasive plants called Caesar's weed, which is native to Africa and Asia, and can dominate the understory of the Florida ecosystems, particularly the pine flatwoods, which is actually where I am right now because my college, the Wilkes Honors College, is right in the middle of the pine flatwoods, so I can go out there every weekend. I was there this morning, just removing invasive plants. And now I have started a new organization called FERN, the Florida Environmental Restoration Research Network, where I continue what I had been doing in high school, now in college. And we do these hands-on restoration events and do our own theoretical and experimental research in invasive species and environmental science, marine science, and public health.
That's awesome. And all the organizations that they mentioned, they'll be put in the chat so you all could have those later on. Now, Sonja, if you could tell us a little bit about how you got started.
Absolutely. For as long as I remember or can remember, I've always had a passion for biology and have been fascinated, especially by water science. I grew up close to the Delaware. I'm a third generation sailor. And for me, childhood was splashing in streams, lifting rocks, seeking out little salamanders, helping turtles cross the road. And I started doing environmental monitoring when I was 6 years old, and it right away became pretty much my favorite thing in the world. I would go out and gather macroinvertebrates by looking at the species that kind of make up the bottom of the food web in the ecosystem. You can get a very strong sense for what environmental factors are acting on that ecosystem. That's something that absolutely fascinated me, especially as the more I did it, I began to notice trends in my data, particularly health declining on some of my sites, decreases in biodiversity, sudden spikes in invasive species, and also more pollution tolerant species, which goes hand in hand with a decrease in more pollution sensitive species. And watching that was fascinating, and it felt like a real call to action for me. And it was something that I kind of began to go further into in research. I joined the Society for Freshwater Science and began presenting there. And at such a young age, I was thrilled to hear that my work was so relevant and that it was the same stuff that all these other freshwater scientists and entomologists, the same trends that they were looking at as well. And that was incredible. I got involved in environmental advocacy when I was around 11. At this time, I had already been teaching kind of bioassessment, and I had this program called like the Wonder of Nature, where I teach students at summer camps, 4-H groups, youth groups, and try to get people all pumped up and excited about bioassessment and all of the amazing things that you can find in your own backyard. I guess another call to action for me was when I was 11. I had a very pristine ecosystem in New Jersey. There's a unique geological phenomenon called the Princeton Ridge that creates, due to the perched water table and the diabase rock, it creates these beautiful wetlands that I really feel like aren't anywhere else in that region. Vernal pools and springs, brimming with old growth forests, and all kinds of amazing and sensitive flora and fauna. And hearing that this place was being threatened by plans to put a natural gas pipeline there, I began to do more work in environmental advocacy. I shared the data that I had been collecting. I started looking more into statistics and data analytics, and looking at how the different factors that seem to influence waterway health, and also just reading up on all of the different organisms that live in aquatic ecosystems or rely on aquatic ecosystems. And one last thing that I think is really amazing is that in an ecosystem, water really is, it's so essential for life. So many organisms use it as a means for breeding, all kinds of animals that lay their eggs in water. And it provides also, it provides food for, I mean, in addition to providing H2O itself, which is vital for survival for organisms, it provides a place for organisms to live that are at the bottom of the food chain. So if you destroy basically a source of water, you can really unravel an ecosystem from the bottom up. And seeing the effects of that can be very disturbing.
Wow, thank you so much, Sonja. It's really amazing. Peter, I'd love to bring you up here next. If you can talk about how you got started in transportation justice.
Sure thing. I mean, in terms of the youth environmental movement, that was something I was a part of since I was 11 years old, working on trying to encourage more of my peers in 6th grade onward, trying to be more green. But when it came to public transit, it's because I had to take a lot of public transit to get places because my family could not afford a car. And of course, my parents were always working. So in order for me to want to do anything, I took the bus. But the service wasn't always the best. And it wasn't until college that I learned that I got connected with more community members who shared those same concerns, and really began that organizing process of showing up at our county office and really trying to petition for better services. And then, of course, this is around the time that the youth environmental movement is really, really picking up speed and traction. And this becomes one of the various ways that young people would like to see our society fight climate change. And I think everything is all history there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Arte, if you could tell us about how you got started in your work.
Yeah. Well, so on a basic level, like the start of the work is when I found, along with a lot of other folks, this nonprofit YUCCA. But I want to take it a little bit earlier than that. I think when people talk about like why they weren't politically active, often it's because they lacked the information, they lacked the context, and in a certain shameful way, I can't say that about myself. I had a lot of the information. The issue is that the information was paralyzing. I grew up in the shadow of generational poverty, especially with my mother. My mother is a Norteño, kind of Mexican-American ethnic group in northern New Mexico. And there's been historic damage to our community. And by the time I got to high school, I had that kind of experience. My father is European, he's white, and pretty quickly kind of in the process of growing up and experiencing both sides of my family, and I promise this connects later to climate change, please bear with me. In experiencing both sides of my family, there was moments where I had cousins in private school in LA through my father's family, and the people I was related to through my mom, I had cousins on the street simultaneously. So by the time I arrive at high school, I'm young, but I've been given a very clear image of racial disparity in the US. At the very least, I've been, something that before I had the words for it, I had the phenomenon. And then at the same time, as soon as I start doing debate stuff, I'm in high school, I'm cynical, I'm tired, and I'm a little condescending. So what do I do if not debates? And so I start doing debate, and I stumble upon the information that paralyzes me in the face of climate change, like the racial analysis. And as soon as I learn what climate change is, I'm given the information to be terrified about it. I pulled it up because I still save it on my desktop. In preparing for a debate tournament, the school that I was from, we had a very small debate team. Actually, it was essentially me by the second year. And I was the team captain because there was no one else. We actually functioned very well together as a team because, again, only one person. It was streamlined. But because of that, we also couldn't pay for any. In debate teams in high school, you can pay and you can get a set of policy papers for students to cite. We couldn't do that, so I had to find my own policy papers. And one of the papers I found is called Existential Climate-Related Security Risk, a Scenario Approach. It's from May 2019 from the National Center for Climate Restoration. And it essentially describes that if there is a significant change, if we reach 2 or 3 degrees of warming, especially 4 degrees of warming by 2050, there is a high existential risk to human civilization. And that is a rather euphemistic way to describe the apocalypse. So, point is, I'm in high school. I've been shown racial inequality. I've been shown, through these policy papers, the incoming cost of climate change. And in both ways, I am fully paralyzed. I don't feel that I, as an individual without a GED, even stand any chance in making any sense of change. I'm traumatized, and in that way, I'm isolated. Then I'm attending an anatomy class. I'm really bad at anatomy, so I'm not paying a great amount of attention. And this friend that I have, Mikiko, tells me that there's going to be a town hall meeting that afternoon about a town level endorsement of the Green New Deal, a city hall level endorsement of the Green New Deal. The city council specifically is meeting. And she invites me to the city council meeting, and I don't have anything else going on. So I do. It's not really a big decision in my life. It later becomes one, but in that moment it's not. And I go to this city council meeting. And I had been doing debate. So talking about stuff is something I have some level of fluency in. And so I go and I give my little speech. They give you 2 minutes in front of the city council, and I tell them, I think the first thing I said was just like, I am scared. I'm scared. And I tell that to the city council members, and I make the argument for please endorse the Green New Deal. And none of that, that's not actually the moment of empowerment. But I leave that city council, little podium, and then another person comes up after me, and another person comes up after me, and another person comes up after me, and another person comes up after them. And they're saying the same thing in different words with different values, but they're saying the same thing, that we're scared and we need you to do something. And then I leave that meeting and I find that group of people. And later on, through a lot of different things, part of that group of people would become the organizing force behind YUCCA. But in that city council meeting, I realized I don't have to. I know that I alone can't change this, but I do fully believe that we can. And I came to the realization that I'm not alone, that we're not alone in facing systemic injustice. And that is the very reason to have hope in the face of it. So that city council meeting set me on that path. And it was a small event, but it was pretty substantial in my life. And thank you to Mikiko for the invitation. She's out there somewhere in the universe. We haven't been in touch in a while, but thank you to her.
Wow. Thank you to Mikiko. It's amazing how sometimes these events that you don't even know, it's just something random that you end up going to, and it can really change your whole life in the direction of what you're studying and what you're doing. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was going to be my next question. Maybe you can talk more about that meeting, or maybe you have another moment, but I wanted to ask you all if there was a specific moment when you feel like you found your power. I remember when I was playing on the beach volleyball team at UC Berkeley, and our coach had told us, if the ball rolls off the court, just let it go, because the grounds team was spraying a toxic chemical around where we were practicing. And I thought that was really concerning. And so I asked the groundskeeper after practice, what he was spraying, and it was an herbicide that causes cancer. And we ended up just asking if our team could pick the weeds instead, so he didn't have to spray it anymore. And he was totally cool with that. And it was just more work for him to have to pick the weeds, but if our team did it instead, he didn't have to spray, therefore he didn't have to be exposed to that chemical either. And in that moment I realized, wow, we actually have so much power as young people to make change, even in just these small ways that end up leading to big ways. And we ended up taking that same model and applying it to the rest of campus and expanding it. And yeah, I'm just curious with all of you, if there was a specific moment that you can mention where you feel like you you really came into your power, especially because you all have started this at such a young age. It's really, really remarkable. So if anybody wants to just start with that question.
I can go ahead if that's okay. So I feel like for me, one of my defining moments in my life was when I presented in front of the Energy Regulatory Commission, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I was 11 years old at the time. I don't think I really realized the gravity of the situation, or the fact that there were, I guess, so many professionals in the room. But I was just pumped up to share my findings on this particular part of Princeton, particularly various water quality analyses, looking at EPT richness, the presence of very sensitive macroinvertebrate families, a list of all of the sensitive flora and fauna that I had seen, charts and graphs looking at like pollution over time in these areas. And what was amazing is afterwards, someone came up to me and told me that in a room full of opinions, I was the only one who brought any data. And later on, this ended up being a win for the for these wetlands, also for the team I was working on. As rather than trenching the stream, they invested more money in tunneling under it, which is a much more environmentally safe and less invasive way of construction. And it was amazing because this beautiful habitat, just because of that change to a more environmentally oriented way of development, it preserved the ecosystem, and it's still there. It's still beautiful. And after that, I learned that there's a lot of power in bringing data to these meetings. There's a lot of power in data in general, and thinking about how so many people kind of came in and kind of said what they felt a natural gas line would do, which is great. But by having these facts, which were then asked for by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, we were able to make a difference, which is amazing. And so I feel like from then on, I've been a very hard advocate for the concept of using data to make land use decisions, making science the language of the debate, and really looking at how these diagnostics of an ecosystem tell us how will this construction affect people who are living downstream, how will this affect the organisms that are living downstream. And the amazing thing about biology and the amazing thing about the ecosystems is everything is so fine-tuned. Everything kind of hums along to like this perfect, it's like a perfect system of cogs and gears. But if something is thrown off, if you cut down a bunch of native species, allow invasive species to grow in, if you remove riparian buffers, if you add impervious surfaces that remove the filtration water gets before it goes into waterways, allowing more non-point source pollutants to get in, or even if you increase the amount of turbidity in the water, that ecosystem can become so easily thrown off, and not just in a way that affects other organisms, but in a way that affects our own health too. And also the cost of water filtration for municipalities. So I feel like seeing this is very important, and that later inspired me to try to seek out new ways to gather environmental data after learning about statistics and attending conferences and becoming well immersed in the ideas of bioassessment and chemical analysis for waterways, looking at different methods of using remote water monitoring sensors, and also looking at the up and coming ideas of using eDNA as well to monitor habitats. I was looking for ways that you could get higher accuracy, precision, and statistical power in waterway health assessment and how to assess the health of an ecosystem, and from there make informed decisions on which plots of land to build on and how to use the least invasive ways possible to make sure that the ecosystem remains balanced and to make sure that human health is protected as well, to make sure that there isn't excess nutrient pollution in our waterways leading to harmful algal blooms, to make sure that flooding is mitigated, to make sure that we don't have overgrowth of invasive species like multiflora rose and Japanese stiltgrass that allow organisms like ticks to thrive in, and to make sure that we don't have water that is so polluted that only hardier organisms like the mosquito can survive. I feel like that is it's just something so important. So I created pretty much a prototype, or I create kind of like a playbook for these microbiology and genetics labs, which can be given to communities and help transform the way they gather environmental data, allow it to be more accurate, more precise, allow the DNA sequences of individual organisms to be stored digitally and used for reference by other organizations, a way to get accurate affirmations of the presence of threatened or endangered species, and a way to track invasive species as well. And I feel like this shows a lot of potential. The prototype lab is working great. And I'm working to set some up with some other organizations as well. And the idea of giving these communities the tools they need to stand up for their own ecosystems and for their own waterways.
Thank you so much, Sonja. Peter, if you can tell us about a time when you feel like you stepped into your power.
Sure thing. I mean, I think the first time we really felt like we stepped into our power was when a bunch of other students and I organized what would be one of a series of across the world, a climate strike back in September of 2019, I believe. And so it's when a bunch of us kids were like, let's just try to show that we as young people really care about climate change. And on the actual day of the strike, we were really surprised by the turnout by young people, not just adults, but like mainly young people, in the hundreds, and just to march down to City Hall to really make to make the case that climate change is a challenge, and that these are some of the ways we need to move away from that, including our transportation sector, which has been built historically in a very horrible way to the environment, and also to people in general. And so that was, I think, one really empowering moment, knowing that one person alone, that we all shared this common goal. It wasn't just one person with one idea, but it's really one of many people, and together, these small ripples come together to make one giant tsunami. So that was, I think, something that was really empowering. And I think another moment where that was really affirming is that I think in large environmental movements, or in large any sort of organization or movement, you can kind of feel like your unique voice is lost in that process, and this is kind of where the second experience where that empowerment comes back, which is that similar story to Arte, which is that I showed up to one of my local government's regional meeting on transit, and each speaker had 2 minutes of public comment, but we each gave our own public comment, and because every story was unique, the message was the same, but each message was infused with a different story and a different set of lens and experience and perspectives. And to see all of these elected officials who are, twice, if not more, at least 3 times our age, actually listen and be compelled and moved by all of those words, and to actually take votes that they otherwise would not have if we had not shown up, I think just really reaffirms that ultimately, like, our voices do matter, and that we are fortunate to live in a society where our voices is the guiding principle of how we structure our life. And so I think I don't think the average person realizes just how much power that they have through their own voice. The being able to speak up and to show people that you care, but also to show the people around you who care, and to inspire that in them, I think is something really powerful. And I think this is something a lot of young people have recognized, and we are now harnessing to try to propel forward change for the better, hopefully.
Yeah, completely agree. And Arte, I know you already mentioned the city council meeting, but if you have anything to add about stepping into your power as an activist.
Yeah. Okay, so I think like the most obvious thing to talk about would be the policy. Oh shoot, I just hit the microphone. I hope that wasn't a terrible audio experience. would be like the policy wins that YUCCA's had, the like 3 major bills that we were able to pass during the last legislative session. And I want to get to those, but I think like those were really the end product of acts of empowerment. When I first got involved in lobbying, there was an older lobbyist, and I say lobbying like environmental lobbying, to be clear, an older environmental lobbyist who told me the one thing that the politicians care about most is re-election. And that's going to be true whether or not you're talking about Democrats, progressives, conservatives. Re-election is going to be, in general, the sticking point. The donations, a lot of lobbying is done through giving like donations or promising future donations or something even slightly more corrupt. A lot of that's being done simply so they can finance a re-election campaign. So again, it's all working towards the re-election potential of this politician. And I think that we can get to a lot of cynicism reasonably often when we talk about like trying to pass policy and trying to trust politicians. And how can we sway this politician if they are so deeply in New Mexico? You have massive oil and gas spending in terms of buying politicians. And how can we sway this politician if they are so controlled by corporate mechanism, by corporate lobbying? And the answer that I've given and the answer that I think is true is that you can do that by changing their re-election chances, right? The money that they're getting is useful in that it allows them to buy media that potentially means they'll get votes, to buy events that potentially mean they'll get votes. But through like grassroots organizing, you can change those votes. You can go to people and say, look at how this person, right? You care about the environment. Look at how this person is consistently voting on water regulation issues, on fracking issues. And you can actually change the constituencies behind the people. And through that, you can change their re-election chances. And you can, A, have leverage to get them to vote the right way and have them be honest to the promises they've made in their campaign. Or B, get someone better qualified in their position who will actually protect the environment, the population, marginalized communities, the future of the human species at a minimum. And so we were able to pass policy, not just because we were in there talking to politicians, but because Peter mentioned that 2019 climate strike, because we had organized in a grassroots way with young people and then with associated communities. We got, I want to say, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people at the New Mexico State Capitol in 2019 for the New Mexico climate strike. And that was an incredible moment. I mentioned my childhood a little bit before. I left my childhood with a diagnosis of CPTSD. And I don't know if any of you know what it is. I think it's what it sounds like in that it's very similar to PTSD, I'm thinking of a different text. Post-traumatic PTSD, post-traumatic, I can't remember the acronym. I think y'all know what PTSD is though. But CPTSD is complex PTSD. And it's essentially a similar thing. It's stress. That's the word. Thank you, Mackenzie, in the chat. Post-traumatic stress disorder. And then it's complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And essentially what it means is that it's the result of a sustained traumatic environment as opposed to a single traumatic incident. Regardless, we don't need to get into the like medical complexities. It meant for me that I had a deep anxiety about being around a lot of people. I had big anxiety about being in crowds. And then I started organizing around climate stuff, but it was a lot of us. It was just like 4 or 5 people in like rented office space. And that fear didn't really come up. Then we do this 4,000 person, 6,000 person strike at the Capitol. And it's the first big protest I'd ever organized. And I wanted to be helpful. So the night before, when we're trying to figure out who's going to lead chants, I volunteer. I feel like I hadn't done enough because I'd been late to the meeting. So I volunteer. The next day, there's me, terrified of being in a crowd, at the center of a crowd, in fact, directing it. With hundreds of people around me, thousands of people around me. And I'm terrified. But as we start to say chants together, as I get up, I'm on a ladder because it's the closest thing we have to a podium. I'm not as scared because I stop looking at these people as like a crowd. I start to recognize friends and family, kids I grew up with, kids I'm going to school with. And I start to recognize that I'm in fact in a community, and there is nowhere safer than in community. Point is, we were able to win our legislative goals, not through specifically pressuring politicians, although we did do that, but by building a community within their constituency and a community that cares for each other and cares for the planet. That was my moment of empowerment back in 2019. And then that empowerment lasted until the 2020 legislative session. And I'm trying to keep it going.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. David, you can share your moment with us.
Absolutely. So as a young scientist, and I think Sonja can attest to this as well, that we are often stifled and kind of looked down upon in our work. And I think a moment where I came into my power was when I was like seen in that sense. And that could have been like when I finally got a parking pass, which was a whole big deal how they wouldn't let me get a parking pass to the lab. But I remember I was giving a presentation, and similar to what Sonja was saying, they were like, this was like good. And they kind of like weren't expecting me to go into such nuanced details about soil chemistry and about the phosphorus and nitrogen and everything that goes on in dirt and the carbon cycle. And they're like, whoa, we underestimated you a little bit. And to finally like hear that I was doing the right thing and I was doing it really well at the graduate level, it was a really nice thing to hear. And so in my work, which is multifaceted, it wasn't just scientific-based research, but implementing it into the community with those educational modules that Mackenzie talked about before. And so I designed these modules based around my research and how invasive species can spread across geography in Florida specifically. And when I go to local elementary schools to teach about these things, you can see these kids light up and see that someone's trusting them to do some really cool science experiments, and they develop this new passion for science that they didn't have before, because oftentimes they're like, you're not smart enough to be doing this, or you're going to do it wrong, leave it to the experts. But we should be encouraging these kids to be the experts, because they're the future scientists and experts. And so to finally hear that what I was doing not only was good, but excellent, was a really amazing thing to hear. And speaking about that parking pass, because I want to talk about that, they wouldn't let me drive to the lab from my school, so I would be missing school and all that, and they didn't want all those legal shenanigans to be going on. But then I finally just kept calling in sick to school to finally be able to go. And once they saw that I was doing something really incredible with my work, like, oh, but we can give this kid an executive parking pass to park in this parking lot. And to be seen in that sort of way was a really nice feeling to have. And to be now a person that encourages young scientists to pursue a career in science. I think it was like 3 days ago, I was giving a talk to a nonprofit out in California about how to get involved in research at such a young age like I did. And that's something that I find really comforting, because not only am I a scientist, but I like being an educator as well, being an advocate for better education for young students.
That's awesome. I love this story about getting out of school. And it's interesting with the scientists, you all talking about giving, research presentations, and for the organizers about going to city council meetings. In some ways, they're really similar. It's, you describe it as, you're one of the youngest people, and maybe people are doubtful, and you speak your truth, and it really matters. And I just want to know if you all had advice for young folks who maybe haven't been to a city council meeting before, or have never, given a presentation about their research, or really not just young people, but really anyone, community members who haven't engaged in that way. What kind of advice could you give them? And I'm curious if your age was a positive thing or a negative thing. Did people not take you seriously and think that you weren't going to have intelligent things to say because of your age, or do you think it made this more compelling? And any advice that you have for people trying to step into that sphere?
Being very persistent is always a great thing to be. Sometimes you'll doubt yourself and you think that you're being annoying to whoever it is you're talking to by sending them a follow-up email and say, hey, I'm looking forward to this presentation, or hey, can you get back to me with this paperwork, or anything along those lines, whatever it is your project and passions are. But being so persistent, you think you're going too far, you're not going far enough. And that is what always helped me. I send follow-up emails after like a week of not hearing back. And that gets me these incredible opportunities, and taking advantage of them always helps me grow as a scientist and as an activist. And that's probably something the biggest thing I could leave you with.
I guess if I could also say some advice, I feel like my best advice for environmental advocacy would be there's honestly so much that can be done, especially on a local scale. And I feel like a lot of times it's almost dismissed how much local land development and infrastructure can affect the environment, and how much localized deforestation, the addition of impervious surfaces, how strongly that can affect your local community, the health of people living in it, and how that can affect environments and ecosystems on a much larger scale as well. So I feel like it's just so important to keep an eye out for these issues. There are always town council meetings going on, and never feel like if you're young, you don't have a place there, because town council meetings, if you're, those are for concerned citizens, and there's no age limit there. And as the future, the next generation, as a younger generation, you're gonna have to live with all of the environmental repercussions of any land development or infrastructure that goes down. So you absolutely belong in town hall. And also, I kind of feel like when it comes to scientific research, I feel like there is no age restriction. And I feel like sometimes I feel like one of the amazing things about scientific research is I feel like the field benefits by having as much of a variety of people in it as possible, people of all different backgrounds, people of all different ages, because I feel like that's how our society progresses forward, by having people view the world from all these different facets and angles. And I honestly, I feel like that's one way to really make a difference. And there's so much to research. There are all these connections. I feel like, especially speaking from a biological angle, or just environmental, there are so many little relationships between different organisms and plants, and there are so many organisms that are affected in ways you never fathomed, from human activity and increased or decreased rain production, or looking at the geology present. There's so many connections. There's so much to discover. And because of that, I feel like the field of environmental science, freshwater biology, is always willing to embrace new people willing to research these topics. Because we recognize just how important it is to look at how these ecosystems come together and how we as humans live in tune with these other organisms.
Yeah. I'll also mention, so like my area, I don't usually speak to the science, right? It's much more the advocacy part of it. And like I'm Hispanic and I'm trans, and I also like specifically want to make this point towards people who in other ways are additionally marginalized aside from just age, right? So being taken legitimately in a space, especially a space that is like fundamentally not designed for you to be taken legitimately in, is hard and can often be terrifying. I talk a lot to people my age and of different backgrounds, and whenever I talk to people my age or younger around like climate organizing or specifically around climate advocacy, the phrase I hear repeatedly is, I just don't know enough. I'm not smart enough, is the phrase I always hear. And that's always like so confusing to me, because A, you are, like I'm confident that you are. And also B, like the people who are in charge of making a lot of these decisions know less than you. I think part of the reason we don't realize that is because we discredit lived experience when we really shouldn't. Like if you believe that climate change is a real thing and an active threat to human life, you're doing better than like anywhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of the US government on a state and federal level. You're more aware of reality than most, or 1/3 of the people who are leading your country and who are making the decisions around this policy. And then B, when I'm talking about marginalized peoples, speaking to other young people of marginalized backgrounds, you have often, like, you might not realize it yet, but you have firsthand experience, especially with environmental racism, with the targeting of extraction, with the ways in which climate change intersects and is foundational and has as a foundational element racial violence. And so when I talk to people, there is this immediate assumption that because you are young, there are people who are smarter than you who are making the decisions. And it is a terrible thing, but often a lot of the people who are making the decisions are not smarter than you. They just played into specifically useful rhetoric and earned themselves an elected position that they are now misusing. And that misuse may cost us all of our futures. So you are smart enough and you can do something, and we have to do something. The other two, just like practical points I'll make, is A, they will absolutely try to tokenize you. It's very useful politically to align yourself with young people because everyone wants young votes. And it's much less likely that they're actually going to listen to the points that you make. So in that way, be aware that not only do you want to take the photo with me, that's wonderful. I would also like to have this conversation with you. And I want to know specifically about what your plans are in terms of policy to get us to this decarbonization date, say, by this date. And then the second thing that I'll make clear, and it was kind of implied in the other one, come in with demands. A lot of the time that when we talk about climate policy, people set far off timelines and they speak in big generalities and they make wonderful claims, but they don't actually have clear, consistent plans to get to those dates of carbon neutrality, or to reduce emissions, or to increase recycling, or et cetera. It's because it's still seen as something that's existential. Climate change is an existential risk. Their solutions are often very abstract when it comes to policy. So as young people, we're living in the world that they're abstracting right now. We will have to live in that abstracted world. So we have to come in with clear and concise demands, and we have to stick to those demands. Even though people might, politicians especially, might be a little bit slippery with the timelines.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
Very similar to what Sonja and Arte said. When I was about a year and a half into my research in land management and as a way to control the invasive species and invasive plant spread, I had been theorizing land management practices. And when I proposed one, they said, "Oh, that won't work. You don't really know what you're talking about." And I said, "They said you haven't lived yet. You haven't experienced it." And I said, "Well, then what have I been doing for the past year and a half? I've just been living in a simulation. Like, what do you mean I don't have the credibility to say what I'm saying? I'm almost an expert in this by now." And I remember my mom sending me a text after going like, "Yeah, you tell them." But I don't want any young scientists out there to think, especially ones that have been doing research and for so long. I don't want you guys to think that they can push you around like this and they can diminish you. And I'm grateful that those people have kind of been pushed aside in my scientific career now, and people like to listen to me because I've got some things to say. And like Sonja was saying, the world scientific community is so much better off when we listen to people of all backgrounds. So young people especially, which is a huge part of my identity as being an 18-year-old scientist, when they listen to us, they can see that we know what we're talking about, and we have these lived experiences to talk about what we do. And we're not people you can push around and say, "You don't know what you're talking about," because we very much do. Sonja and Arte and I are and Peter, we're some of the smartest people here. So we deserve to be listened to.
Heck yeah. I agree with that. Thank you so much. Arte, you talked a bit about environmental justice, and I think at this point, everyone who's tuning in will hopefully know, the term environmental justice. But if you can just explain a little bit more about what that means for you in your community, and you talk about politicians talking about climate change and these abstractions and goals of 2030 or 2050, and would just love to hear your perspective of, how is climate change impacting your community right now? This isn't something that, is happening in years to come. It's happening now. And I loved in your Broward Youth Award video, you were saying action should be taken as soon as you're finished with this sentence. You definitely feel this sense of urgency. And if you can just talk a little bit about what that means in your community.
Yeah. No, I mentioned how slow some of the timelines are, right? And almost all of the timelines are, in fact, slow, especially when it comes to like U.S. climate policy. But part of the reason that those timelines are so slow, that we're talking about reducing carbon emissions as opposed to halting carbon emissions, is because the people who are being immediately hurt by both the costs of climate change and also the process of extraction for fossil fuels, those people are not predominantly white people, right? So then it becomes viable for these politicians to talk to their white constituents or their white constituents about these slow timelines, because the lives that are being sacrificed at this moment are lives that American society has already treated as socially dead, as forfeit. And so those lives are sacrificed involuntarily. There's something called a sacrifice zone. Some of you probably already know about this. Sacrifice zone specifically refers to the kind of informal, but sometimes often formal process of designating specific areas with poor, rural, and non-white enough populations to be considered sacrifice zones, areas where we can do massive energy extraction with very little land reclamation and very little concern about the health effects that this energy extraction will cause, right? One of the national sacrifice zones is the Four Corners region near where I grew up in New Mexico. The Four Corners refers to the median of 4 different state borders, one of which is the New Mexican border. And the Four Corners region has its coal plants and its extraction areas. And you can see that those extraction areas have led to incredibly high rates of asthma within the Four Corners region. And then when COVID hit, those incredibly high rates of asthma, which are high in general within New Mexico and are higher, asthma rates are significantly higher for Black and brown populations globally, nationally, although I assume likely globally as well. Those really high rates of asthma led to the increased lethality of COVID-19, right? If you've spent decades, the Four Corners region was designated a sacrifice zone by the Nixon administration initially, right? If you've spent decades sacrificing the lungs of these children, of these parents, of these elders, then when a disease that targets specifically the cardiovascular system emerges and reaches a pandemic level, that's a community that's going to die at a much faster rate. And that's a community that has also very little investment in infrastructure, thanks to those same government processes of targeting and violence. So that's one example. And you can see the very real cost in lives that it causes. Fracking in general also causes stillbirths, it causes earthquakes, it causes cancer rates. And so even without COVID-19, these are lethal processes. And then you can even look at the relationship of man camps to fracking sites. Fracking, oil and gas extraction, typically they don't hire people in the area. They bring in workers from out of state, and they set up what are called man camps at the fracking sites. And those man camps have been linked very clearly to intense spikes of sexual trafficking, of homicide, of murder, specifically for Black and brown women, for Indigenous women and Black women in the area. And so you have this process that kills all of these people, that is currently killing our planet, that is founded on the sacrificing of health, on the trafficking of women and femmes. And that process right now, we're talking about how can we maybe reduce it by 2050? How can we do carbon sequestration? How can we move forward as a society without doing as little harm as possible to the oil industry? The oil industry that is at this moment harming so many people in so many unforgivable and fundamentally lethal ways. And the reason that we're talking about it that way, that we're not talking about fossil fuel abolition, is because the lives being sacrificed right now, although the lives that will be sacrificed by climate change will include every population, but the lives being sacrificed right now are disproportionately Black and brown. And so environmental justice looks like fossil fuel abolition, and it looks like treating the lives that are being sacrificed now as human lives, because they are, and they have not been treated as such. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for the audience, you can't see our internal chat, but we're all saying Arte for president. And going off in this chat. So thank you so much, Arte, for speaking on that. Peter, could you talk a little bit about the environmental justice impacts on your community when it comes to transit?
Yeah, I mean, it's whatever Arte just said is exactly that. A lot of the environmental impact is poor air quality, and just because of the way redlining was done historically, because of redlining, it's no coincidence that a lot of the neighborhoods that are, happen to be in the direction of where air pollution flows and blows is communities of color. And these are the same communities that when COVID hit, because they have lower lung respiratory health, they're the ones who also, just combined with having to be on the front lines and working these low wage service jobs, they're the ones who are the ones who ended up struggling and suffering from the pandemic, but also just environmental challenges. And of course, in California, we have these major wildfires that just add to the horrible air qualities that we have to deal with. And so when it comes to really being able to get people away from cars and into transit, it's our way of trying to rectify that historical wrong. It's trying to move away from the whole emphasis on the car and that rugged individualism that has kind of made, I think, all of us immune or desensitized to the needs of each other. And really, that's really the environmental impact that I think we're trying to achieve for generations to come. And I think the challenge with this work too is that because we are a multiracial, multicultural region, it's trying to find the votes that will constitute a majority to kind of push this through. And so that's always been a balancing act, I think, in this work. But I think ultimately, as long as we keep our eyes on sight on the environmental impacts and really the vision that we have, we'll continue to march towards that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Sandina has put in the chat some of the links for these orgs, and we'll continue to put them in at the end too, in case you just joined. And if you have questions, just a reminder, put them in the Q&A because we're going to get to that in a second. So Heidi, I know you've written a few questions, so don't worry, I will get to that in just a few minutes. The last question I want to ask all of you was just what gives you hope in these dark times? Anyone who wants to start first?
I would have to say, Sonja, it's always the two of us.
Go ahead.
Okay. I would have to say it's my students that I work with in local schools. And I get to see their new emerging passion for science that I'm not going to take credit for introducing them to it, but I get to see it happen when I bring these modules and experiments for them to do and for them to see particularly environmental science happen in front of them and ways that they can help. I find that so heartwarming, and it's a great feeling to have to be the person that introduces them to this, and I really like that. It gives me hope that I can keep doing this and keep being the great scientist that I want to be. And yeah, I think that's where I'll leave it at that.
I guess kind of going off of what David said, I also teach classes and kind of write curriculums. And a lot of times I will bring groups out into the woods in the stream and kind of walk them through freshwater bioassessment. And I feel like what gives me hope is seeing people of all ages from all different backgrounds and seeing when their faces light up when they find a macroinvertebrate that is very pollution sensitive, or a salamander or a turtle or a snake. And that gives me hope because those are the things that inspired me growing up. And I want my own children and I want them to also be able to go out into the woods and to see salamanders and to pick berries from native plants. And that gives me hope. Another thing is just every little win. So I work for a land conservation nonprofit, and every win we get, no matter how much, I guess, of an uphill battle it has to be to get land conserved, that gives me hope. So we actually recently got an additional 153 acres of old growth forest and highly ecologically sensitive wetlands preserved in Princeton, New Jersey. And it came so close to us not getting it, but now I feel like I can take a deep breath and I picture, all of the plants there, all of the salamanders and the snakes, they can breathe easy too, because them and their descendants will be protected now forever. And that gives me a lot of hope, and knowing that hopefully people in our local community, after seeing how we secured this plot of land and how we plan to make all of them into a greater network of preserves and trails, so people from all over the area can come and they can see old growth forests how they should be, and see the boulder fields and the springs and the cattails. And hopefully they will feel empowered to support us for our next plans to get more plots of land preserved, and continue to keep these places pristine, especially considering that they're headwaters to local drinking water sources as well.
It's always like a source of joy when I get to work with folks younger than myself, people like of the same age group, my peers. And if only because I was working with this class of middle schoolers in New York. I was just over Zoom, so it was possible at the time. And I was working with a friend of mine who specifically teaches like middle schoolers around climate science. And we were doing this thing where we were supposed to introduce them to the idea that climate change affects people by kind of like asking, what do you think what are the effects of climate change? And then they'd say polar bears or icebergs. And we say, okay, what happens do you think when like all of that ice melts? And be like, okay, maybe now it affects like cities and it affects people living near beaches. And then like, who is it going to affect the most? And then we could start to like reach the topic of environmental racism with these young people. And we asked the question, my friend asked the question, what do you think climate change affects? And this kid in this middle school class unmutes. He goes, it kills people, mutes himself. Something along that line. I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, it kills me. And the teacher's like, who said that? He unmutes, kills people, mutes himself again. And he was there. Like he was fully like the process of like education and like treating climate change as an issue of human life, like the gravity of it. He's like, what, probably like 11 if you're in a 7th grade. He's 11 and he's there. And his peers, I think, at least as the product of like sharing the space with him, are closer to being there. And I wasn't there when I was his age. I meet people who are younger than me, and they're so much smarter than. And people used to say that to me when I was young, and I found it so like frustrating. But now I end up saying it again because they're so much smarter than I was at their age, and those people are now taking over like the leadership roles that I'm vacating as I move into later parts of my life, and they're going to be so much better at those roles than me. And I don't know, that provides me a lot of hope. Just the idea that like the community and the young people, like that I don't actually have to be perfect because together we can be, and we're getting better.
And I had a similar train of thought to Arte, in which I was thinking to myself, what is there not to be hopeful for? Just because we have so many people in the world who are trying to do better, and that they're trying to build a life that, because of their existence, only more good was generated into the world. And I thought there are so many people. I think all people are trying their best to do what they think is best, given the knowledge that they have. And I think it's just sometimes that we're just trying to work with the knowledge that we have, and it's incomplete. And we're trying to clarify all of that. And I think that's something that I learned in my work, especially when we had to deal with people who were on opposing sides of what we were trying to achieve. I think is trying to recognize that. And so I think for me, like what gives me hope is just knowing that we are all trying to do well, to do what we think is best, but also we have so much potential in each of our own to learn, to grow, to inspire each other, and to, no matter where we are in life, to ultimately do something that will change people. So for the example of Arte, it's just, your presence in that classroom sparked, enabled this young student to really come into that student's own and really be able to voice that perspective, and maybe that perspective being shared has inspired more people. And so I think just knowing that we're all able to help each other get better is what really inspires and brings hope to me.
Thank you so much. It's amazing how everyone talks about, people younger than them. That gives them hope. And for people listening here, I'm sure it's you all, that give them hope. All right, we're gonna get into some Q&A from the audience. We'll go through it kind of quickly. We probably won't be able, not everyone will be able to answer each question, but if you feel like you have an answer, just jump right in. The first question is from Heidi, who's a high school environmental science teacher. And Heidi says, what themes would you consider are the most important to teach during a month-long class on environmental justice? For example, diversity, resilience, observation, etc.
I can help or provide a potential answer for this one. When I teach about, not necessarily just environmental justice, when I teach about environmentalism in general, one concept I really like to try to really emphasize is the fact that humans, we don't live above in an ecosystem. While it seems like we can be inside of our home and look out the window, we are still, no matter what we do, we're always going to be a part of our surrounding ecosystem, which means that, we give off, we exhale carbon dioxide, we inhale the oxygen. We are part of our ecosystem. We're not in our own bubble. And because of that, I feel like it's really important to emphasize that by making sure that we are taking care of the ecosystem around us, we are also protecting human health. And what is good for all of the different organisms we see outside is also good for us, because we all want clean air, we all want clean water, and we all want open spaces in which we can live in and be both physically and mentally healthy. And I feel like it's also really important to keep in mind that when it comes to looking at ways to develop lands, and when it comes to looking at, I guess, how we shape the environments around us, that there's always someone downstream, and there's always someone who's affected. And the way it works is there's little kind of almost like ripples that can go along. And it's also important to keep in mind, a big issue in my community is flood mitigation. Due to excessive construction near waterways and using impervious surfaces like concrete, you have all of this flood water that's being sent into, I live right in between Trenton and Princeton, and there's a lot of polarity there, unfortunately. But all of the flood water gets sent, the way the rivers work, towards these areas where people don't have necessarily the resources to recover from a flood. And I feel like it's also just very important to emphasize who's downstream and the fact that human actions really impact our surrounding ecosystems. And also that climate change isn't necessarily like a broad overreaching thing. Climate change can also apply locally, in the sense that as humans, we're physically altering our climates around us.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I'll mention super quickly, the thing I mentioned before is I think pretty useful, like being like, how does it affect, who does it affect, and like leading through that chain, if they're not there already, to the idea of like, okay, it affects human beings, and it affects certain human beings who are already oppressed by systems the most. I would also say, like, there's an issue sometimes in climate education where we stumble upon this like conclusion that human civilization is antithetical to biodiversity, is like opposed to natural life. And that's not true. We just have one very specific iteration of human civilization that's not doing particularly well at this moment. And so looking at other examples and kind of straying from a purely Eurocentric understanding of climate history. I know those are a lot of terms to like communicate. But I think it's super valuable, even if it's just talking about like, hey, who lived here before us? Whose land are we on right now? And connecting that also to the issue of climate change.
Thank you so much. And we had a question from Emily. Emily says, whenever I talk about how climate change is real and we need to act now, many are skeptical and ask what solutions there are for this existential risk, as Arte places it. If you were put in that position, what would you say to that person?
I just talked, but I'll be super quick. Abolish fossil fuels. Like that's what's causing climate change in big amounts. It's the top 1% of top 1 to 10% of earners, their emissions, and then also specifically emissions as a result of the fossil fuel industry. Keep it in the ground. That's the most effective way to stop fossil fuel use on every level. So abolish fossil fuels. There are bans on fracking in certain U.S. states. It's possible on a national level, and the U.S. is one of the we lead or we're in like the lead in terms of per capita pollution. So a change in U.S. policy, people will like to bring up China as if like our impacts are negligible. We have a massive role internationally, and the national banning of fossil fuels would do an incredible amount to slow climate change and to mitigate the already rising costs.
Thank you so much. Okay, in the last couple minutes, I just want everyone to go around and say how people can support your work, repeat your organizations. Sandina will put them in the chat again, or Katie. And also all the panelists left their emails. So Katie, if you can just put that in the chat, they give you permission to contact them after if you have more questions. And also, what could everybody here do in the next 24 hours to support your work? Okay, David, we're going to start with you. How can people support you?
Okay. Well, my new organization, the Fern, was started in August, so we're still getting off the ground and starting here on my college campus. But a great thing to do is to give us a follow on Instagram, because that is where we keep up to date with everything. And we're starting donations live chat link to get some funds so that we can go out and do some more hands-on restoration that we've already done. But other than that, we're starting some composting on campus and doing some really cool research in seagrass. And so follow us on Instagram at the Fern, 2 R's, 1 N, and that's where you can stay up to date with everything that we're doing.
Thank you so much. Whoever wants to just go next.
I can go next. So I work for as mentioned before, land conservation nonprofit called Ridgeview Conservancy, and we're currently working to try to conserve an additional 90-acre lot, which has some of the most amazing and pristine vernal pools in the area, which provide a breeding area for numerous very sensitive amphibian species, as well as very unusual insect species as well. I think, there's a link to the website. You can always check that out. Another thing I employ you all to do is, if you're interested in getting involved in local environmental advocacy, I really recommend you look at what land development is going on in your community, in your area. Go to some town meetings and try to see, what are they doing to, do they plan to replenish native species that they're removing, or are they going to let the invasives take over? Or what is their plan for putting down impervious concrete? How are they going to mitigate flooding? And all kinds of important stuff like that. I also have a prototype microbiology and genetics lab at the Watershed Institute. And feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to help set up a lab at your organization as well.
I know we're very short on time, so I will be very quick, but you can always learn more about my group's work called Turnout for Transit, Turnout, the number 4 and Transit, but also Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action, or SVYCA, to learn more about our work. But I think in your immediate local community, just take a bus, and if you have the time, check out your local government's meeting and see what you can do from there, because I think, at least for me and Archie, that's where we started, and we took it from there. So thank you.
I'll try to be even faster. My website, our organization's website was, I think, in the chat, yucca.nm for Instagram. If you're in New Mexico, please follow us, keep up to date. There will be calls to action coming through there. If you're not in New Mexico, feel free to reach out to me if you're trying to start something. I'm always happy to just like talk or help on any level to groups or individuals. That said, I am also in St. Louis right now. I'm working on a grant to like do some environmental racism, climate education with a group of young people, both from this university and then also from the surrounding community. We've got our first 1,500. We're always looking for new funders because we really want to like hire St. Louis community members full time. So reach out to me, please, if you've got money and you want to invest in like educating on environmental racism. And finally, right now we're dealing with the effects of climate change and the way that this winter is increasingly worse, much lower temperatures than previous ones. That's especially bad for unhoused populations. Right now, in terms of climate advocacy, it's not just about preventing climate change. We also have to mitigate the already costly effects. Go volunteer at a soup kitchen. Go offer food. Go offer supplies. If you have any medical skills, people are going to need help. So look into the organizations that are providing relief for unhoused populations right now. Work at a shelter, etc. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, panelists, for the work that you're doing. You all are incredible. I know you can't see the chat either, but there were a lot of messages relayed about how amazing y'all are. And so, yeah, thank you so much for your work. Thank you, Bioneers, for having us. And we'll all be in touch.